مرحبا. مساء الخير من تايوان. أرحب بكم قبل أن نبدأ الجلسة مع المشتركين اليوم معنا. أحب أن أوجه انتباهكم إلى وجود الترجمة الفورية اليوم. فإذا لمن أحب أن يستمع إلى الحوار باللغة العربية أو باللغة الإنجليزية، خاصة باللغة العربية الآن، ممكن أن تنظروا إلى أسفل الشاشة فتجدون علامة على شكل كرة أرضية. Click on it. ستجدون ترجمة عربية أو إنجليزية. فإذا بتفضلوا تستمعوا إلى الحوار بالعربية, please click on the Arabic translation. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event on translation and culture. This event is brought to you by SOAS and the Sheikh Zayed Book Award. The Sheikh Zayed Book Award is one of the world's leading prizes dedicated to Arabic literature and culture. Since 2006, the award has brought recognition, reward, and readership to outstanding work by authors, translators, publishers, and organizations around the world. In 2018, the award also launched a translation grant to help produce more quality Arabic books in translation outside the Arab world. SOAS is, of course, famous for its global reach and commitment to the global South. SOAS is a world-leading center in the study of the Arab world with a high profile in cultural literary and translation studies. There will be a series of 4 events in April, May, and June, coinciding and leading up to the award announcements in May. In these events, we will bring together creative writers, translators, and researchers to talk about the role and place of Arabic culture and literature in today's ever-increasing global connectedness. These events are advertised already, but you can also look them up on SOAS website. Keyword Sheikh Zayed Book Award. In today's event, we focus on translation and cultural exchange, starting with the idea that translators are cultural ambassadors. Together, we will think about translation, why we translate, from and into which language, and what and how we translate. We will also reflect on the choices we make in relation to genre, such as poetry, fiction, cookbooks, or philosophy, and our approach to translation and the style we adopt. More importantly, we will think about the thrills and perils of the world of translation, the field, the market, and translation prizes, and of course, what translation can do to promote cultural exchange and global understanding. We have with us today 3 distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them very briefly, then let them speak for themselves. Nawal Nasrallah is a translator for the best of delectable foods and dishes from Al-Andalus and Al-Maghrib. She is shortlisted for the Sheikh Zayed Book Awards in the translation category this year. We have also Katherine Halls, a literary translator, and the 2021 recipient of Penheim Translation Fund grant for the translation of Haytham al-Wardani's Things That Can't Be Fixed. And we have with us, Professor Wang Yuyong, Professor of Arabic Language and Literature at the Shanghai International Studies University, who translate Chinese classics into Arabic. Our events are all bilingual. We will speak in both Arabic and English, but I think Nawal, myself, and Katherine will speak in English, and Professor Wang will speak in Arabic. So Tariq, our translator, will be busy tonight moving between 2 languages. So let me now come to the format of the event. We have about 60 minutes, and if pushed, we can go beyond by about 15 minutes, And the format, to save time, we'll have 2 rounds from our panelists, right? So individual panelists will make an opening statement between 5 and 7 minutes each, right? And second round, right, once everybody is finished, right, they will come back and respond to each other in 3 to 5 minutes. I may come in to ask questions, or the speakers, the panelists, can ask questions as well. And once we go through our proceedings, we'll open the floor to questions and answers. Please use the question and answer function to send in your questions, and we'll pick them up. I'll probably read them aloud when it comes to that. Now, before we start, right, we have some housekeeping issues. First of all, I already explained this in Arabic, but maybe I will explain this in English again, right? We provide simultaneous translation today, and Tariq is behind the scene doing the hard work. And if you want to access the event in Arabic, go to the bottom of your screen, and on your right, you'll see an icon with the picture of a globe. Underneath it, there's interpretation. Click on that, and then you'll see off Arabic or English, and just choose the language you wish to listen to, right? And again, please use the question and answer to ask the panelists your questions. So without further ado, let me turn to our distinguished panelists, and we'll start with Nawal Nasrallah.
Hi, thank you, Professor. Let me start by saying that translation came to me as an accidental career. Before coming to the United States in 1990, I used to be a professor at the universities of Baghdad and Mosul, teaching English literature, English language. But when I came to the States in 1990, of course, Iraq was in the news all the time, and people started asking me, what Iraqis ate? This is their way of connecting with us. So I discovered that there were none. I decided to write a cookbook on the Iraqi cuisine, but since, of course, I have this zeal for research, from my previous career, so I decided to make it half a cookbook and half history and culture. So I dug into the archives, and to my surprise, I found that ancient recipes written in Akkadian on cuneiform tablets coming back from my country, Iraq, in Babylon. They go back to 1700. Other surprises, I found that there were 2 Baghdadi cookbooks, one from the 10th century and one from the 13th century. Both of them came from Baghdad. To add more to these, I discovered that other cookbooks from medieval times were also written from Egypt, the Levant, Andalus, and of course, Al-Maghrib. So I worked on these for 6 years in order to write my cookbook, which came as Delights from the Garden of Eden. Took me about, it's a long time to come. And then I decided, after finishing this book, that I would translate those Arabic cookbooks. And that is how my career as a translator started. So why cookbooks? Because I saw in these cookbooks a wealth of information on the Arab world during the medieval times, when little was known in the West about this region during this period. I thought that was a chance for me to, through food, through its culture, to make our Arab culture, better understood by the West. So I started with the 10th century cookbook, Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, which was a huge book, 132 chapters. Not only that, not only recipes, but it got lots of poems, lots of food poetry, lots of anecdotes. So I said I will translate all these because they also reflect the gastronomic culture, the flourishing gastronomic culture at the time. So it took me a while to finish this, years to finish this, and then after that, this is the Baghdadi cookbook, 10th century. After that, I turned to Egypt because Egypt, after the decline of Baghdad after the Mongol attacks, Egypt became the center of the Arab world. And there was a book called Kanz al-Fawaid fi Tanwi' al-Mawa'id. That was also, but it was different this time. It was only recipes. Nonetheless, it was really a valuable resource for knowing about how food developed in the 14th century. And it came out as treasure trove of benefits and variety at the table. And then after that, I moved westwards and I translated, this is my newest work, Best of Delectable Foods and Dishes. So far, I have done 3 books, but they are major ones. They are huge books. And they are really valuable resources on, on our knowledge of the Arab world. And I'm proud that I was able to do this, and hopefully more are to come.
Thank you so much, Nawal. I have more questions for you later, but I'll keep that for later. Katherine, let's turn to you now.
Thanks, that's making me hungry, but I'll try and focus. Thank you very much, Wen-chin, for inviting us, and thank you to the Sheikh Zayed Book Awards for helping organize this. Wen-chin posed us an interesting set of questions to think about when we were, thinking about how to introduce ourselves. And I have to admit that when I came to translation, it wasn't because I had a particular mission in mind, something that I wanted to discover or to bring to Anglophone readers. I came to translation because I love the Arabic language. I studied Arabic and Hebrew at university for my undergraduate degree, and I am simply in love with Semitic languages. I think they are a true masterpiece of human civilization with their amazing triliteral roots and derived verb forms. Anyway, that's all a bit nerdy, but that's how I first kind of got involved with Arabic and began translating things. And it's still really important to me because always engaging extremely closely with the text itself and making sure I've understood every last detail, and that kind of technical rigor is really, really, really important to me when I translate. That's, I think, paramount. But I came to translation in a more practical sense through working on a lot of videos of citizen media videos of the Egyptian Revolution. I was helping friends and comrades in Egypt subtitle them, and I realized what a wonderful challenge translation is, subtitling in particular, because it's a whole technical task of its own, but translation, I really enjoyed that, and that was how I ended up getting into translation. These days, I'm a translator mainly of contemporary literary fiction, and as I said, having been first just motivated by my love of language, it's only kind of over the course of my career that I've come to think more about why I translate and what I think is important about it and why I keep doing it. And I think it really gets to the heart of kind of quite big philosophical questions about the self and the other, and who we are and who other people are and how we relate to them. I often hear translators talking about the idea of, introducing one culture to another, or bringing sort of unknown facts and experiences about the other to Anglophone readers. And in some senses, I agree with that. That's a valuable task, but I think when we're engaging with art and literature produced by something we see as the other, we're also finding out about ourselves. And there's something very important to me about that combination and that tension between discovering new things, discovering unfamiliar things, and recognizing also the familiar and rethinking the familiar. So that's always very important to me. when I'm thinking about what I want to translate, and when I'm even thinking about how to translate. And I think a couple of the recent projects I've worked on that's really been the driving force behind them. One thing I've just finished, it's not published yet, and I'm looking for a publisher, so if you're interested, get in touch, is a translation of this wonderful book. It's very shiny, so I don't know if you can see the title. It's called Muhawala Litadakkur Wajhi, which is by an Egyptian, well, she's a filmmaker primarily and an artist called Salma Tarzi, but I also think she's an amazing, amazing writer. It's written in Egyptian vernacular. And it's about family, it's about losing a parent, it's about losing grandparents, and it's about growing up and bereavement and depression. And it's about really quite universal subjects that I think anybody can identify with. Certainly I have been able to. But of course it has a very, very individual and very specific feel to it, because it's written by somebody in Egypt and in that context. And I think it has this wonderful combination of familiar and unfamiliar, which I really love in literature. And another project, which I'm coming to the end of now, is the one Wen-chin mentioned in the introduction. It's a book of short stories by Haytham Wardani called Things That Can't Be Fixed, which are set between Germany and Egypt. The author lives in Germany, but he comes from Egypt. And they're just, they have that same combination of the strange and the odd, whether that's because they come from some other country that we don't know, or whether that's because they come from perhaps a parallel universe. I won't give away too much, but there are strange goings on in all of his stories. And also they're very familiar, Berlin. I live in Berlin, so there's a lot of the dreary Berlin cityscape, and I love that combination. I suppose, I suppose we may talk about this a little bit more later, but some of the things that really matter to me in translation as a field are that rigor that I talked about earlier, technical rigor. I think there's a bit of a kind of often fruitless debate that goes on about the tension between something being technically right and also being a good literary product in its own right. You may recall the kind of furore over Deborah Smith's translation of Han Kang's The Vegetarian, which won this, extremely prestigious prize, and yet there were a lot of people saying that she'd made so many mistakes in translation from the Korean. And I feel I can talk about this with some kind of distance because I know nothing about Korean as a language, Korean language or Korean literature. But that was, I think, a somewhat fruitless debate, because a good translation has to be both of these things, doesn't it? It has to be technically right. You can't have mistakes, and yet it also has to be this good literary product in its own right, which makes translation quite a unique art form, I think. And that's one of the things that makes it such a challenging and always stimulating job. I'll leave it there for now, and perhaps we'll return to some of these subjects.
You have a second round, right? So you will all come back and then talk more.
We'll get into the nitty-gritty then.
We'll get to, and I will have questions to ask you as well if you stop and I feel that I want to hear more. والآن إلى الدكتور وانغ الذي سيتحدث باللغة العربية عن ترجمته العربية من الصينية، وخاصة الكتب الكلاسية بالصينية.
طيب، السلام عليكم أيها الحضور الكرام. اسمح لي أن أشارككم بPPT. أوكي. في هذه المناسبة أولا أريد أن أعبر عن الشكر الجزيل إلى جائزة الشيخ الزايد للكتاب، وكذلك جامعة SOAS. فبالنسبة للعلاقة بين الترجمة والثقافة، أعتقد أن لا توجد ثقافة من دون ترجمة، ولا توجد ترجمة من دون ثقافة، فهما كالجسد وروح. فالثقافة هي قلب الترجمة واللبها الفاعل. ولذلك بدأت أترجم الكلاسيكيات الصينية، وترجمة الكلاسيكيات الصينية ترجمة ثقافية إلى حد كبير، وهي تشتمل على ترجمة داخل اللغة واحد والترجمة من لغة إلى أخرى. إذ كانت الكلاسيكية الصينية مكتوبة باللغة الصينية القديمة فتحتاج ترجمتها إلى نقلها بداية من الصينية القديمة إلى الصينية الحديثة قبل نقلها إلى الصينية الحديثة إلى اللغة العربية الحديثة. وهذا يعني قد يؤدي إلى إفقادها بعض مما كانت تتفرد به من الدلالات والأوزان والإيقاعات والأساليب. يعني بدأت أترجم الكلاسيكية الصينية إلى العربية قبل 10 سنوات، يعني بعد أن تعلمت اللغة العربية أكثر من 30 سنة، يعني في عام 1985. وتعاونت مع مؤسسة فكر عربي، وهذه مؤسسة قد أصدرت لي 4 الكتب الكلاسيكية، وهي شينزي والليتي وأحاديث عن جذور الحكمة ومسامرات بجوار الموقد. إن شاء الله يعني سوف تصدر لي الكتاب الخامس وهي حافظي في هذا العام، عام 2022. يعني أما كتاب شينزي فشينزي هو فيلسوف صيني القديم، هو بادر لأول مرة في التاريخ الصيني إلى القول بالطبع الشرير للإنسان، وهذا يختلف عن منشوس الذي آمن بالطبع الخير للإنسان، وهو داعيا إلى سحر الآداب والقوانين في بوتقة واحدة، وإلى إيماء اهتمام بالغ بتحذيب الخلقي والعقاب القانوني. وهذا يعني الجملة مأخوذة من هذا الكتاب، مثل من يعد ما هو صائب صائبا وما هو خاطئ خاطئا هو عاقل، ومن يعد ما هو خاطئ صائبا وما هو صائب خاطئا هو جاهل. نعم. والكتاب الثاني هو كتاب ليتسي، يعني والليتسي هو فيلسوف شهير في عصر الممالك المتحاربة الصينية، وأول مفكر يدعو إلى نظرية المراحل الأربع لنشأة الكون، وأول أديب يجمع بين أسطورة والحكمة في عصر ما قبل أسرة تشين الملكية. وأيضا هناك جملة أو عبارات مأخوذة من هذا الكتاب: أعمى قول لا يقال، وأسمى فعل لا يفعل بفعل، ومن يساير عصره يزدهر، ومن يخالف عصره ينتثر. أما الكتاب الثالث فهو كتاب أحاديث عن جذور الحكمة، وبقلم الفيلسوف الصيني هونغ يين مين. وهذا الكتاب يضم مجموعة كبيرة من الأقوال المأثورة، وهذه الأقوال المأثورة تتناول كيفية تهذيب النفس ومعاشرة الناس ومعالجة أمور وتبادل تعامل مع العالم. ومنها بعض العبارات، مثلا: حينما لا تعنيك عزة والذلة ستغدو هادئا في مشاهدة تفتح الأزهار وسقوطها أمام الفناء، وحينما لا يهمك الرحيل والبقاء ستغدو دائما هائما في متابعة انقباض السحب أو انبساطها فوق السماء. هذا هو الكتاب الذي أحاديث عن جذور الحكمة. أما الكتاب الرابع فهو يعني مسامرات بجوار الموقد، يعني وهذا الكتاب هو يضم 221 حكمة، وتدور موضوعاتها حول الإنسان واستقراره وأمنها وحول الوجود برمته. ومنها سوف أضربك مثلا من هذا الجملة من هذه مأخوذة من هذا الكتاب: لا يمكن للإنسان ألا يحمل طموحات عظيمة، فإن لم يكن طموحا فسيغدو ملوثا بما هو وحر وملطخا بما هو وسخ، حتى لا تتحقق له أي إنجازات، ولا يمكن للإنسان أن يحمل أطماعا كبيرة، فإن كان طماعا
If he's greedy, he will let go of all what's close to him, running after to all what's distant. So don't expect any successes out of such a person. As for the fifth book that has not been printed or published yet, and I will share with you some of the quotes from this book, like: what does not last will not last, and what's empty will not live longer. It's not smart for a person to talk about what they don't know, nor a loyal who keeps what they know from others. This is some of the most famous quotations from the and wise sayings from the Warring States era. And he is the most prominent speaker for the legal school way of thought. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our second session. And we will continue our talk. Thank you very much again.
شكرا جزيلا يا Dr. Wang. So we come now to our round 2. So we go back to Nawal. Now that all of you have listened to each other, I wonder whether, what you have said, right, triggered anything. So we go to round 2 and we return to Nawal. So Nawal, if there's a comeback from you or addition from you. Unmute yourself. You're muted.
Okay. First of all, I'm interested in asking Wang about he mentioned that classical Chinese is different from modern Chinese. And in order to translate it into Arabic, he had to translate he had to use, did he use the Arabic modernized, the Chinese modernized version in order to translate the Chinese? I'm asking because in Arabic, we have a different case. Arabic language did not change much from medieval times and the standard Arabic nowadays we use today. I mean, it changed regarding vocabulary, regarding, of course, with the changes of times. But basically, I can easily read like 10th century, 9th century manuscripts and they read perfectly all right to me. I mean, it didn't change that much. So I'm interested in knowing about the situation in China. How was it like? I mean, is it like English, for example? Chaucer, for example, he wrote in the 14th century, but I don't understand it. I have to read it translated into, modern English. So I'd like him to elaborate on this language issue.
I will save him for later. But, Nawal, is there anything else that you would like to add to what you had said earlier?
Yeah, well, I realized that I was, too brief in my presentation. The 3 books I translated, I consider them a wealth. They are sources for wealth of information on the that important period in the Arab world. Translating them into English, by translating them into English, I tried to fill a gap in the knowledge in the Western world of what happened during between the antiquity, times of antiquity, and after, let's say, 14th, 15th century. In the West world, they noticed that there are certain, the European cuisine started to use certain ingredients like rose water, lots of sugar, and saffron. And these are all, Arab ingredients. So how come they feature in those European cookbooks? And before translating those books, before, having really concrete evidence of what happened during from the period of 9th and 14th century in the Arab world, couldn't stand in their discussions. They couldn't stand on firm grounds on what really happened. But here we have in those books like primary sources. They are here you have recipes using those ingredients. There is a concrete evidence of what happened and how this happened. The speculation is that the influence of the Arab world on Western, medieval Western cuisine happened through 2 venues, either through the Crusaders or through the 8 centuries of Arab stay in Al-Andalus. Both ways, of course, they had their venues in order to, transmit this culinary tradition from east to west. But I think that Al-Andalus, during those 8 centuries, it played a really a significant role in the transmission of this information. And that's why I find that the last book I translated, A Best of Delectable Foods of Dishes, I find it very important because it was written in the 13th century. It's a well-written book. It's a huge book, very well organized. And you can easily see, what was cooking at the time and the things that were transmitted. I have an issue with indirect translations. You lose so much. We talk about lost in translation, which is true. Because I know from what happened in medieval times, for example, books on dietetics by physicians like Ibn Jazla, Ibn Butlan, their books were important. And the Western world realized their importance for specialists and for the laymen. What happened was they had to translate them, first of all, into Latin. Other countries, European countries, wanted to also know about them. So from Latin, for example, to German. And if you compare the Latin with the German, you see that they didn't really get the, full benefit of those wonderful books. That's why, to me, primary sources like those cookbooks, they are important. They also, give us also a knowledge, firm knowledge on Arabic cuisine. I don't really also, they are beneficial to the Western research, but they are also important for us as Arabs because they give us, really a full image of what happened and how things developed, because now we are all practicing Arabic cuisine. How did we get it? How did it develop? We go to those primary sources from different parts of the Arab world, from Baghdad, Egypt, from Morocco, Al-Andalus, and we see what continued, what discontinued, and so on. Even there are things I didn't know, I discovered while doing these. For example, I'm really thrilled about this this Andalusi cookbook, because in it you find the beginning, the dish. We say in Morocco it's bastila, or they call it bastia. It's really a big thing in North Africa. But there, in the 13th century, we have a recipe that describes how this dish was made. And in another Andalusi cookbook, it was called al-Faraj. That is the mother of happy endings. I think, this is my theory, I think they call it the mother of happy endings because it is such a difficult dish. It's really a pain in the neck. But then after cooking this dish, there you go, you have a bundle of joy. That's why they called it, mother of happy endings. So all these discoveries, you make, they are the things that keep you going. And, it's not easy work, but it keeps you going. Another thing I discovered, and I was thrilled when I did my Egyptian cookbook, The Treasure Trove. Had I not translated this book, I would have missed something very important, which is a certain tool that is mentioned only in one manuscript, and it is called, they call it mifrak. From what I understood is that it was used like today's we use this stand blender, and I discovered that there was something used in Egypt going back to the Roman times. And there is a picture of it. I saw a picture of it in the Alexandrian, in the museum in Alexandria. When I probed into this subject even further, I discovered that the same tool is still being used in southern Egypt and Sudan, and they also call it mifrak. So I was so fascinated that my husband made for me the mifrak. The way they use it is that they do this like this, in the dishes, and they blend them. This tells us really, tells us something, that if something is good, it works, it stays. So, you get so many lessons when you read those books, but you have to pay attention. You have to be patient. If I hadn't translated this book, I wouldn't have discovered this. Another thing, those cookbooks are also important in that we read, for example, in Al-Mas'udi, so many stories, or Al-Ghani, about food, about dishes they mention. Up until the 80s, before the beginning of the editing of those Arabic books, we didn't know whether these were exaggerations. Were they true? Did this really thing happen? For example, I read in Al-Mas'udi about a dish that cost 1,000 dirhams. It was made with fish tongues. And it was the favorite dish of Harun al-Rashid's half brother Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi, who was a gastronomic authority at the time. And I found in the 10th century cookbook, by Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, a recipe which is like aspic and uses tongues of fishes, lots of them, and it is said that it was the favorite of Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi. So, we have to, they also, this is another function for those recipes. They also confirm, or, they tell us whether, we can tell whether those stories were exaggerated, or they were based on things that really happened. Which I rather, think that they were not really mere exaggerations or the product of their imagination. Because in the Moroccan, and the Andalusi book I translated, in my research, for example, I read Ibn Khaldun, for example, said that the diet of the Andalusis, the urbanites among them, that was mostly made with chicken and lamb. And I think, I believe this because in this chapter, in the chapters on mutton and lamb, and in the chicken chapter, we have more than 40 recipes of chicken and lamb. So we've got to believe what they say. Also, another thing, that we read in the books that there was somebody held a party in which nothing served but chicken, chicken dishes, lots of them. And of course, with that many dishes you find in Al-Tujibi's book, you've got to believe them. So, there's no end to the benefits of those books.
Great, thank you, Nawal. Yeah, let's turn to Katherine now. There's a second wind.
I'm amazed. I didn't even know fish had tongues, so I've learned something very interesting today. Thank you, Nawal. Wow, that was so interesting. Just a couple of reflections on what both of you have said, both of my co-panelists. I'm very interested in the kind of historical aspects of what you do, as the translation process that you both have to go through as your work, and I share Nawal's interest in the challenges of translating from Old Chinese, Yuyong. So I'd be really interested to hear more about that. And I think, Nawal, in your case, I imagine there must be quite a lot of more practical translation, if I can call it that, involved in things like working out what measurements are and so on. Like if they say, I don't know, I give you a currency for 1 dirham's worth of this or whatever, then I suppose you have to work out what on earth that was worth and how much that translates into as a quantity of the ingredient. So I'm really curious as to how you go about doing that, and whether or not you actually try your recipes, because that seems to me like a really interesting kind of translation?
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I mean, up until
Nawal, sorry. Can we sort of like let Katherine finish and then come back to you to answer these questions?
Okay.
Like, let me sort of like do this so that Dr. Wang would have some time to talk as well. Yeah, Katherine?
I was also reflecting as you were both speaking on, I think you're obviously both extremely invested in translating a very specific genre and a specific body of knowledge, which is really, really interesting. And I'm curious as to the motives for doing that. I can imagine that one motive might be to showcase what is a simply brilliant and interesting culture in its own right, whether it's the cuisine of the medieval Islamic world, or the philosophy of the Chinese classics. And I'm interested, is that a big part of why you do it? Is there also an interest in this body of knowledge as something to learn from and something that's relevant to us today? Because some of those words of wisdom, Professor Wang, I wonder if you see them as something that could give us things to reflect on in modern life, whether it's us reading them or people who read them in Arabic. And Nawal, I noticed that you're with your interest in these very, very practical things like this implement used in your cookbooks. Are you interested in how the people of the past lived and what that can tell us? I'm curious about that kind of motive. I've done some historical translation myself, a little bit less recently, but some of the academic work that I was doing during my studies involved looking at the writings of Jews in Arabic, and I've translated a fair bit of stuff by Abu Nadara, who was an Egyptian nationalist. He was Jewish and he wrote primarily in Arabic, but he also appears to have written in Italian and French. I guess he was a polymath and a real character. And a couple of other Jewish writers also of Arabic. And I think on the one hand, that's interesting as a body of literature because it's simply great writing. I mean, Abu Nadara is funny. He's a caricaturist as well. He's not, it's cartoons accompanied by text and poetry and captions and speech bubbles. And it's wonderful to read, but it's also a glimpse of a very different time when things were very different in the Middle East, and it was perfectly normal for Jews to speak and write in Arabic. And I think that is something that we can learn from in itself. So for me, there's that double motive of, showcasing this wonderful body of literature, but also thinking about what we can learn from this time gone by and the way that these people used to write. I think I'll leave it there for now because I've asked so many questions.
Okay, so Nawal, hold your thoughts. I'll turn to Dr. Wang, right, for his few words, right, and please, respond. It looks like إنه الأسئلة كلها موجهة إليك. فسort خلينا نسمع منك.
طيب شكرا جزيلا.
Okay, thank you very much for this question that I have been tasked to answer by Dr. Nawal and Ms. Katherine. In truth, this is a question that all translators are keen to know more about, whether from the Chinese side or the Arabic one. Because these classics, as I have said and mentioned before, are written in ancient Chinese. So we don't have any basis in the ancient Chinese, and we cannot express their way, their unique way in this very short sayings, keeping it short. Just like the Arabic saying, the best talk is what is short and direct to the meaning. So how can we express these Chinese classics in their own way and their own exceptional writing skills? This is the great challenge that faces all translators, whether from the Chinese side or the Arabic one. As for the Arabic one, when I translate Chinese classics, I always review the explanations, the descriptions of these classics, the explanations, the interpretations of these ancient Chinese and in modern Chinese, in order for me to understand them, to grasp their meaning. However, when I pick the words, I have to choose according to the ancient Chinese texts and not according to the modern one, the contemporary one. Because if we are translating Chinese classics in modern Chinese, this will lead to a loss and to prolong things, which was not something that the ancient Chinese texts were keen on having. They averted it. So we're trying to keep things short according to the ancient language. So how can we strengthen our roots in ancient Chinese? We Chinese people, we read poems and ancient Chinese texts to establish ourselves in ancient Chinese first. Since our early childhood, from elementary school, and we recite, we memorize poems, just like Arabs do with their poetry, in order to express with less words in a more refined manner, that gives more meaning. So this is the challenge, the first challenge in translating Chinese classics. So this question takes me to another one, leads me to another one. Who's going to translate into Chinese classics? As I think, a Chinese translator should pick classics. However, he has to collaborate and keenly between the Chinese translator and the Arabic editor or reviewer, to be in a way that is to be innovative to the Arab audience, and to transfer these Chinese classics, these Chinese philosophy into the Arab audience in the right manner, in a way that attracts and is close to the hearts of the Arab readers. This is what I wanted to talk. I wanted to talk about these two issues or topics. Who's translating Chinese classics, and what are the challenges that they're facing, that we face in translating these Chinese classics? I hope that my answer was convincing and fulfilling. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we sort of open this sort of Q&A to the audience, Nawal, you wanted to answer Katherine's questions, and then please go ahead while I think about how to bring all of you together, right? So just go ahead, Nawal, if you want to.
Well, Katherine, you asked me about amounts and the equivalence in modern, in modern usage. Well, let me begin by saying that up until the mid 20th century or something, we all cooked by what they say. We say eye measurement. I mean, we don't use measurements, and most of the recipes in those books, they depended on the knowledge of the cook, on the eye measurements, but they also, in some of the recipes, we have exact measurements, and for giving equivalence, which I did. I mean, wherever there are measurements in those books, between brackets, I give the equivalence in pounds, in ounces, in grams, because I want to give the reader an idea of the proportions. This is important for the consistency, the resulting consistency of the dish. There are sources that discuss how much is, for example, qirat, how much is a ratil, and how much it was in that time. So I used those tables in order to make those equivalents. It wasn't really that difficult because that was an important matter in the Muslim world, or how much for example, people during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, how much was it worth? Because, when they had to, to give exact measurements and to emulate for example, the ways of the ways that were done during the time. The other question was, what was it? The motive? My motive.
Yes.
And the values about reading things from the distant past and knowing how people lived a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, when I read those books, of course, I was blown away, so to speak, by all the information I found there, by the similarities, I became really quite convinced that of the continuity of the Arabic cuisine, especially in Iraq, because now I know how we cook things. I know how things were cooked during the Babylonian times from those Babylonian, ancient recipes. And I have 2 books from Baghdad cooking those dishes. And I was able to see, the progression of the cuisine in the same region, which you do not find, was really a rare chance for me, which you do not find in the discussion of the cuisines of other cultures. And what motivated me also was because, I read about the food studies, about the new research on medieval times, whether in Al-Andalus, whether in the Levant, Iraq, and I see that there are certain things that were misunderstood, because, of course, that was due to lack of information. For example, in one of a small book by al-Baghdadi, the 13th century, was translated by Orientalist Arbery. But there was a dish that we do not, a condiment we do not use nowadays. It is murri, which is the equivalent of fish sauce, for example, in Southeast Asia, or the soy sauce in China. It was a very laborious thing that we know very little about until we got, of course, other recipes in the rest of the books. So Arbery, of course, I don't blame him. He translated something called Boudanej as he thought it was Foudanej, which was pennyroyal, a kind of mint. So the resulting recipe, for example, he gave to generations of readers, he gave the impression that this fermented sauce was made with mint and other things, which in fact it was not. Foudanej was rotted bread. They made, it was not fish-based, it was not soybeans-based, it was cereal-based, this fermented sauce. In order to begin the fermentation, they had to prepare dough and make and cause it to rot. They keep it for 40 days. They wrap this dough in fig leaves and they cover them until they rot. And they use this part in order to make the fermented sauce. So I thought, he gave generations of readers the wrong impression. This is the danger, of not interpreting things the right way. It's not
might have led to food poisoning, right? Might have led to food poisoning.
Yeah, we have to be careful.
Let me sort of try to make links. And today we're talking about translation and cultural exchange and so on and so forth. So I'm going to pulling all, while we wait for the audience to write up their questions, I'm going to share with you an anecdote and an idea. Okay. So as a child who grew up in Libya, right, I had fried birds, right, cooked birds, roast birds, and so on and so forth. Never had in Libyan cuisine birds cooked in brine. So I thought that was
cooks where?
In brine in soup, right? In brine, right?
Yeah.
It came with this. So sort of, I went to sort of like Nanjing for a conference, and I was there. And Nanjing is famous for its duck cooked in brin, 咸水鸭 in Chinese, right? And what was sort of my host said, well, come, you would like this. And, and he found out I was interested in cuisines, in semiotics of food, and in Islam and in the Arab world. And he said, oh, you didn't know this dish, 咸水鸭, is brought to China by the Muslims. I said, what? Arabs, no such thing. So Nawal, I went to the cookbook you translated, في مطبخ الخليفة or الخلفاء. I found the recipes. Right?
Oh, which one was it?
They're all of them, different ones. But you have this pot, you soup, you water, and then you put
stews. Stews.
Not stews, right? You just dip the bird in very quickly. You take it out, cut it, and then you put sort of condiment garnishes on it.
So this was So
it is really, the cuisine. This kind of cuisine travel. Right? And then in time we forget about them. And I come to Katherine's questions, right? Why are we interested in reading about the past? And I want to come back to this idea that all of you brought to the foreground today. And I want to use the word adab in Arabic and wen in Chinese to think about it, right? So adab, ummahat al-kutub al-Siniya, ummahat al-kutub al-Arabiya, these all belong to this category of wen and adab. And these two categories include poetry, history, fiction storytelling, aesthetics, and ethics all together. So these two categories, and what I see here is this conversation, right, among you, but also among the different parts of our literary culture, if I can say it this way. And I want to come to you, Nawal, and ask you about the relationship between the ethics of health, of maintaining health, and cuisine, which is a huge part of cookbooks, right?
Yeah.
It's not like the kind of political war we get in about hummus and falafel, but it's really about that. But also when Ibn Butlan writes in Da'wat al-Atibba, he's having fun. It's aesthetic, it's literary, and that's what Katherine is concerned with, right? But it is also philosophical. It's ethics of everyday living that Professor Wang is telling us about in Ummahat al-Kutub al-Siniya, in the classic Chinese classics. So can we have some comments about this and about sort of how these cultures, classical, modern, Chinese and Arabic, bring us together to an area where we can think about something called global humanities, which is a topic we will address in our event number 4. Yeah, and the interest, all our interest in that, while I wait for questions from the audience. Yeah, shall we? Yeah, Nawal, you're enthusiastic. Let's start with you.
Well, let me give the chance to others. Well, I'll speak till later.
You will speak last? Okay, maybe we'll reverse the order. Dr. Wang, yeah? نبدأ بك. 王老师，听得见吗？
听得见，
请你来，请你先说。مداخلة، نبدأ المداخلة منك بك.
المداخلة
يعني أنا العلاقة.
Your intervention about the relationship between Chinese culture and the Arabic one through contemplating about Arabic culture and when Chinese culture, basically culture or literature, between Arabic and exchanging thoughts, توارد الخواطر, for example, exchanging thoughts. It's a relationship between Chinese classics and Arabic literary classics, right? What is your question again, please? The question was not clear to me. The question was not clear. I'll repeat it. I'll try. I forgot my own question. I would like to connect and bridge the gap between the 3 interventions, between yours, Nawal's, and Katherine's. through connecting these three interventions through the concept of Arabic literature and Chinese literature. We find in Wen and in Arabic literature, in both of them, we find books or texts that are philosophical in nature, cultural, civilized, artistic, literary, and all of them artistic, and all of them they answer topics that are not just artistic in nature, but also philosophic and ethical and health-wise. To take care of your health as part of your daily ethics, your daily way of being. Could you give us your own remarks on what's similar between Chinese philosophy or wisdom? I think it's better to call them wisdoms, Chinese wisdom and Arabic wisdom. So this compatibility between the two. In truth, Chinese culture is quite keen on combining or on the relationship between a human being, his society, and nature. As for literature, this is a word of utmost importance in Chinese culture, whether it was in Chinese classics. So when we are talking here about philosophy, we always combine philosophy with literature, or we express a certain philosophical idea in a literary manner. As well as when we eat, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, we are keen and we give importance to the color and the shape and the way it looks. Of course, and taste as well, to these Chinese dishes. So it's not just taste, but we are also keen on the way it's presented. Sometimes we make a flower shape or a type of bird. We make a type of bird, a shape of bird on the table so that people on that table would enjoy it through eyesight just as much through their tongues. So we enjoy both its taste and its looks, which indicates that Chinese culture is quite keen on combining both philosophy, thoughts, and literature. As for literature, since the earliest times, China, just like the Arabic nation has poetry. Just like Arabs were keen on poetry, we have a book on songs that was before the Qi dynasty, which has various
أو تدور حول مواضيع مختلفة.
different types of literature that develop and evolve from one age to another and diversify. And at the same time, we take from Arabic literature, just like Mr. Bassam in the fourth event. In the upcoming fourth event, he has translated many Arabic works into Chinese, like Khalil Gibran's works, as well as poems, Mahmoud Darwish's poems. So, we academics, we are very keen on transferring Arabic culture and Arabic art and literature into Chinese, which means that there's this rich exchange between the two cultures, and we benefit from one another. Thank you very much.
Shukran laka. Katherine. Katherine, reverse order. You're still in the middle.
I'm going to very much echo what Yuyong has said there, I think, although I'm going to answer your question in a slightly roundabout way. I'd like to just return to what Yuyong said in his last intervention about the importance of working with an Arabic language editor when he's translating from Chinese. I think this is something that we often forget about translation. There's an image of the translator who sits alone, surrounded by books in their library, their dictionaries. But of course, translation is always collaborative. I often find that in my work, I'm always ringing up friends to ask them what things mean, or to ask them how they interpret things, because in the end, translators are readers and we have our own interpretations. I'm interested in thinking about other readers' interpretations as well as my own. And sadly, I think in Anglophone publishing, there isn't enough of an appreciation of how important it is to have editors who are specialized in editing translations and who can do so with reference to the original Arabic. That's something I'd love to see a lot more of, and I think that would help very much in helping cement rigor, a kind of standard of good standards of rigor within the publishing of translations from Arabic. But translation is collaborative. That's one thing. And the other thing that translation is I suppose a constant striving for perfection that might possibly never arrive. And Nawal didn't mention this today, but we met a couple of days ago just to test Zoom and so on, and she was telling us about some recipes which called for fish as an ingredient but didn't say what kind of fish it was. And I thought this idea of a mystery fish was just such a wonderful metaphor for something that we all come across in translation, which is these things that you just can't quite work out, and these things that remain out of reach somehow. And I think that's so often an experience. I've had it in, I wouldn't claim any of my translations are perfect. There are always things I haven't quite managed to get my head around. So translation is always collaborative. Translation is always exploratory. And
creative, right?
Yeah,
creative,
absolutely.
Right?
Of course. And if I come back now to the idea of global humanities, that's not a term I tend to particularly think of my work as being involved in, but I would say that the same is true of our humanity. That it's collaborative, that it's exploratory, that it's creative, and this is why I'm so interested in reading and engaging with the writings of others. Be they, in my case, I translate writings that come from perhaps a different place, perhaps simply a different language community. Many of the writers whose work I translate actually live in the same city as me, so they're not such geographical others. They just happen to use a different language of expression. But, Nawal and Yuyong both translate the writings of historical others as well. And I think that I would go so far as say that our humanity is incomplete when we don't engage with the thoughts and the artistic products of those others, or when we treat them merely as curios, to be just kind of looked at as something that's different. So that's my thought on your question of humanities and humanity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katherine. Before I let you have the misk al-khitam, Nawal, I'm going to read to you a comment from one of our guests who is attending from China, Eileen Chen, right? I have one comment for Nawal. Philippe Hetty also included that fish tongue anecdote in his history, an unforgettable story. In the Chinese tradition, fish whiskers very comparable, are said to be an utmost delicacy. The eras of your translation, the 10th century of Baghdad one, and the 13th century of Andalusian one, and the 14th century of the Cairene one, actually were the golden ages of each one of the different areas of the Islamic world. We as readers and researchers of medieval times, thank you so much for your continuous efforts in making these delicious translations.
That makes my day.
Lucky misk al-khitam.
Yeah.
And of course, before I thank everyone, lucky misk al-khitam.
Well, you talked about humanities in the world, and I would like to comment on the transmission of of this culture, of those ideas among the nations, and of course, as regards my specialty, I can see this those cuisines as being transmitted from one region to the other. It's interesting to see how they develop, as they, as they migrate to other places and, settle there and develop. But you talked about Chinese dishes you found similar to al-warraq, which I don't find surprising because we know that the Arabic cuisine during medieval times, like 14th century or something, during the Mughals, there are certain dishes that you find during that period. They were through the Mughals. They were transmitted to India, and also to China when they were, ruled by the Mughals. There is this book, A Soup for the Khan. It's a translation of a Chinese book on an ancient book on dietetics and proper eating. And there are recipes, in fact, that are similar to the 13th century, Baghdadi cookbook. So there is always this influence, to and fro, from those places. And those basic, resources we are providing through translation, all of us, they help us in deciphering all those movements, among cultures. And, I think they are really essential.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for gracing us with your presence and for your contributions and for your delicious discourses. The event is recorded for those of you who want to listen to this or will want to sort of circulate it. It's recorded. But I don't know how it's going to be disseminated, but I'm sure someone will give you an answer. So let's us all together thank our distinguished panelists again for sharing their thoughts, their practices, and more importantly, their translations across regions, cultures, languages, and times. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you, Professor Ouyang. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And thank you both.